Hello everyone, this is Dark Journalist. Tonight I have a special interview for you with Intuitive Mystic Gigi Young. Gigi's explosive Mars Mystery series revealed the elite obsession with Mars and the human origin story. Now she's giving us a deep look at the promotion of a false alien narrative versus genuine UFO encounters. She also goes deep on Atlantean Automatons, the strange creatures cited by the mystery schools who left a hidden message regarding ancient genetic engineering. Please join us now. Gigi, it's great to have you back. Let's start with the astroturfing by networks on these deep subjects that we've seen.
Oh, they sit there and they're looking back. They're saying, well, we don't have her on our team, but we can dissect the topics, and like plug them down. And then they'll have really like bad people imitate them. That's what interests me too. They don't do a good job.
Yeah, it's always from because I mean, for me, as long as they're doing it in a sincere way, I guess on a higher level, I'm just glad the information's getting out. Like one level of me is kind of like that.
Yeah.
But I think the issue is like some of these topics, they're just being covered from like an intellectual place.
Exactly.
So it's just intellectual conversations about spirituality. There's no initiating quality. And so that's a problem. In the long run, that's a problem because a lot of it is how things are talked about, when information is introduced, the order in which information is introduced. That's just as important as the information. So when you have these people come and astroturf or steal information, they're just looking at that and saying, how can I take this and make money from it? How can I be liked? And or how can I profit from this? And that's profaning the topic. If you want to do that with hairspray or toothpaste or whatever that is, that's fine. But you can't approach this field, especially esoterica, in that way. It's creating delusion because there's a very specific way that these things have to be introduced and talked about so that people are like the consciousness is prepared. And it has to be done through love, not like, hey, I found out this thing that, it's sort of just like, there's a way when you start getting into this topic, like prehistory, interdimensionals, initiation, things like this. And it's really not something that can be poached. And it actually becomes like spiritually dangerous to do that. So
no question.
It's like an intellectual thing. It's not even spiritual at that point.
Right. It doesn't stay. It's like fast food. It's the thrill of the moment and then you forget it. It doesn't stay with you. But it excites that kind of reaction. And we've seen movement.
People think they're having a spiritual experience. They think they're talking about spirituality, but they're not. It's just an intellectual approach to it. That's really dangerous. People thinking that because they're talking about it, that they're having a spiritual experience, which is, this is an Ahrimanic, sort of.
Exactly.
Tendency. Yeah.
That is fascinating. And we can start with this too, because we had that very strange report that came out, and this ties into 3 or 4 different things. But this one, it came out and they said, hey, the military, Sean Kirkpatrick, this military official with Avi Loeb, they're saying over at the Pentagon that, and Avi Loeb is over here at Harvard, the astrophysics lab, and he's like, oh, I'm watching for those UAPs, and he has the whole Galileo project and all the rest. Interestingly enough, he's come through with this report with Kirkpatrick from the Pentagon saying, oh, there are motherships, alien motherships. This is the actual terminology they're using in our galaxy, in our system, watching us. Now, Gigi, talk about UFO threat language. What do they hope to accomplish with that?
Well, I have to say, when I read it, I thought it was a joke. I had to read several different times to see if this was actually real. And the Pentagon was actually saying that there was basically this mothership flying around the Earth, spraying people with tiny particles to basically spy or observe humanity. Completely bizarre article that just kind of slipped out in the middle of the night or something. And my first feeling was, why are they using the terminology mothership?
Yeah.
Why are they using that terminology? Why are they doing that? And, because at the end of the day, we actually have this technology. So we have basically the von Neumann self-replicating probes.
Yes. And it's interesting that they used von Neumann there too.
Right, and von Neumann, he's a Martian, right? We know that he's a Martian, so little Mars mysteries there. But we have this technology. So we also have Mark Zuckerberg, who funded and was going to create Starshot with a star chip. And Starshot is basically exactly what the Pentagon was describing. So Starshot is basically this giant sail that goes out into the cosmos that runs on solar power, and it just goes out and hums along, and it's looking for life outside on the exoplanets or in other star systems. What Zuckerberg was focusing on was Alpha Centauri at the time. And then it releases all of these little chips called star chips, or basically von Neumann self-replicating probes. And they go and they scan or do whatever they do. They can do many different things, planets to see if there's life. And so this is a technology that we have. There's nothing that suggests that process or that technology is alien. Von Neumann was talking about this, 60 years ago or so, or 70 years ago. It's been written about in science fiction repeatedly over and over again by various different authors. And then all of a sudden, I think 15 years ago, Zuckerberg is now wanting to launch this and get funding for this and do this. So why on earth would we ever think that that's a mothership, or that that's even out there, or that's even like an alien when we have that technology? So it seems like a way to introduce technologies that we actually already have as alien. And also there's a huge, obviously, for people who don't know about the kind of advanced technologies we do have, they're going to feel very threatened by the idea of a mothership. And oh my God, something is like spraying these tiny, this is an existential crisis kind of stuff. And when people go into that state, that translates to obviously a defense budget and defense funding and things like that. So there's many different angles going on here. One is the alien threat, right? Always very obscure, but fear and existential crisis always occurs, right?
Yeah.
And all these, as you've mentioned on your show, you have all these offices being opened up for this. So let me get this straight. We have like Arrow and all these UFO offices opening up in the country, and now suddenly a mothership appears that's spraying tiny particles on us.
Yeah, and it's just too convenient.
It's just like, it's an operation. It's so painfully obvious. So
yeah, it's fascinating. You have Harvard involved. You've got the April Haynes, the director of national intelligence. She's top cop as far as the intelligence community. And that's dangerous because she was also involved in the exercises before the lead up to the COVID op. She was right there doing all the simulations of that with Gates and all the rest. And here she is showing up for this other thing.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect.
Well, it's like the four horsemen are on the field.
Yeah.
This is interesting though, and I get so much around the astroturfing aspect of it as well, because again, they're taking something which has been there in human consciousness, human experience for 70, 80 years, at least in the public, a lot longer than that, and they're adopting it for a purpose. They're adopting it for an emergency. There's a threat, and therefore we take emergency powers when there are threats. The president of France, saying there's an emergency budget thing, just overrode his entire legislature, and he said, well, I'm going to raise the retirement age here in terms of benefits, so that saves the budget, but nobody can do anything about it. So they have to move into these weird emergency stances, and that gets me into what happened last month. And it's funny because right after the episode that we did, then all this UFO shoot down nonsense happened. So I didn't get a chance to talk with you on air about it. But behind the scenes, we've had some good conversations.
We have, yeah. That was.
Tell me what was going on with that, and the NORAD COG general coming out and doing all this stuff, and them running these irresponsible headlines about aliens and shoot downs.
That was just a bizarre. I mean, it seemed like an aspect of it was like a trial balloon in a way to see what they can get away with.
Yeah.
And to basically introduce the beginning of the alien threat paradigm, or the alien, invasion thing, whatever angle, even alien savior thing down the line could also be the case later. It seemed like they were just going to run that and then watch the response on social media and listen to people and see how people responded to that on one element, to see how people are registering. But obviously the most concerning thing was, the emergency powers, and just basically using that as a way to usurp rights. I mean, it was right out of Carol Rosin's talk. I mean,
yes.
With Werner von Braun talking about the reality that, this covert group inside the government that he obviously knew a lot about and was part of was going to do exactly that and use emergency powers to basically seize control. Calling it Homeland or the motherland doesn't really, that's a very
We'll protect the homeland, Gigi. We'll protect the homeland.
It was an attempt. They're moving it forward. I think there will be more this year. Yeah.
Interesting. A little sort of looking off into the future. It seems like that was one kind of a setup.
I think that was like, it was effective in that they did move things forward. But if I had to say, I genuinely think their approach is probably, 30 or 40 years too late. I think the way they're approaching this is not overall going to work. I think humanity is at a different kind of awareness and consciousness, and this probably would have worked in the 70s or 60s more than the way that they're doing it today.
Interesting. Well, I think what you said there about them sort of data mining the event is fascinating, because we saw a few months before that happened, Russia say, we shot down a UFO, and then they had their own weird incident where they shut down their airspace over Moscow after our shoot downs. And they said there's a UFO in our airspace and we've taken care of it. And there have been a number of kind of false alarms going on, false reports coming out of their media. Oh, it got hacked. There was a nuclear this and that. Hide in your house. That whole theme, we're starting to get on that territory of what kind of responses you'd get in an actual emergency, but tying it up with the UFO thing, Gigi,
that's really strange. I actually really enjoyed yours and Joseph Farrell's talk about the third party that could be involved.
Yes.
And that third, like we're thinking in terms of like just basic countries, but what if there is a hidden force that has advanced technology, that has no allegiance to any country, that is also coming forward and causing also a lot of awkward situations, but maybe trying to usurp power as well. So destabilize things, right?
Yes. That's the danger. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it does feel at times like there's some kind of a blackmailing influence that's going on.
It does. There's definitely something in the shadows that wants to come forward, and I think basically rule society. And I think it's been around for a long time, and I think they have to eventually come forward and be open. And I think we're beginning to see that. But there's obviously, with any kind of darker group like this, there's always so much infighting that goes on.
Right.
And it's never simple. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that this year as well. A lot of infighting between different groups and things like that. They're kind of their own worst enemy, you know?
Yeah, right. That's that whole thing where, at the end they end up shooting each other in the back. But we're in the middle of the crossfire. I think that's the problem.
Yes, and the nuclear stuff is really strange and really unusual, because psychically, whenever I've tuned into that, it's always, the nuclear energy thing has always been a magical thing for this group, or for darker groups in the world. It's never just been about, making a bomb or power. There's always been, that I've felt looking at it, a sort of, there's a religion around it. And there's some kind of magic around it. There's some kind of ceremonial thing as well. So that's why when it was over Malmstrom and they bring up the UFOs and the nuclear stuff, I mean, I think that they're actually hinting at a very real belief system that they have around, nuclear forces.
Interesting. Yes.
Yeah.
I found out a few things about, because you came and told me some interesting things about the name Malmstrom itself,
Oh, yes.
which I found interesting, and we should get into that.
Yeah,
But,
sure.
one thing I'll tell you, I found about the person who they named it for, Colonel Malmstrom. He actually died under strange circumstances in a plane crash after he came back from being a prisoner of war in Montana. He had this plane crash. When he was a prisoner of war for the Nazis, they made him fly the most advanced stuff that they had because they figured out his background as a pilot.
Interesting.
So, so Malmstrom, all kinds of interesting influences there. The other weird thing about Malmstrom is we have General Chance Saltzman, who is, the guy who runs Space Force. He's the top cop for Space Force. And there he is right in the middle of all this. But where did he serve a term for 10 years to get all these accolades in his background? He was at Malmstrom. He was there. And so, you've got the Roswell connection with the NORAD COG commander for Northcom, and you've got this guy, and he has the Space Force connection, but he's got the Malmstrom, which is also the big UFO nuclear incident. What kind of footprints are we seeing there?
Yeah, well, that's actually not too far from my stomping ground. I was born in actually Alberta, which is basically Montana North,
Yes.
And there are some very primitive sun wheels there as well. It's very remote, as it's very low population density. You could really get away with a lot of things in that area and in Canada as well. It's just not a lot of people. And it's very possible that there could be some kind of sacred site. I think that there's also a meteor crater that I think it's called Beaver or something. I also had a vision of that, like that there's something to do with craters or meteor craters that are also significant. Even where they fall is significant. It's like a ceremonial thing. And I think that there's one around there as well. And there's also one under the Great Lakes. Many of the Great Lakes also have craters from meteors.
Very interesting. This idea of, something coming in from the solar system and creating this incredible impact. And then, I've been told by Graham Hancock and others that some of the incredible ceremonial mounds, like the Serpent Mound in Ohio, is in fact a heavily, a comet struck that section a long time ago. So it magnetizes, it creates this whole different piece. So there's something there in what you're saying, Gigi, which has two elements to it. One is a physical impact piece, but there's some ancient knowledge that when you get a site like this, somehow all these opportunities open up.
Yeah, and it's like, I think that we have to open our mind to, at the highest level of the military, it having a ceremonial element to it. I mean, we definitely see kind of some of that with that famous military guy that is a Satanist. I can't remember his name. Aquino.
Yes.
He's like that very high level military and also
Unbelievable.
Satanist. So it's interesting to see that. But I do think that when you get to the very top of these organizations, I think that there is a ceremonial reason for things. I mean, even the dropping of the atomic bomb happened on the Lion's Gate or Christ's Transfiguration window. And so I think that we need to start thinking about the government or elite groups functioning on a ceremonial level, as well as a social and political level as well.
Well, it's funny because that type of detail has escaped in the background in the past with people like Nixon or Reagan or even FDR having, psychics and astrologers and things of this nature. But they ridicule it on the surface, Gigi. So it's like there's two patterns that operate on an official level. It's either ridicule or co-opt, but you never get the real thing. That's why people waiting around for CIA disclosure and things like that. It's one of the craziest thing I can imagine somebody doing is expecting those people to disclose anything. They'd be the ones who would want to use it for the types of purposes that they've been engaged in from the beginning.
Oh, absolutely. If you get any kind of disclosure, whatever they're disclosing is because that's what they're going to use to basically control humanity in the next level of our society. It's not going to be like a genuine, hey, let's talk about it. It's no, we're we're gonna let's philosophize.
No rap sessions with intelligence.
Yeah, it's not a group project. It's like, okay, we're going to introduce this technology. We're going to introduce this concept, and then this is going to become your religion, and this is going to become your new way of life, and you'll beg for it, and we'll make you fight for that. And so there's a whole weird, thing that goes on with the disclosure community that is, a bizarre dynamic, I think, in a lot of ways. So
there's no question. And it's interesting too, because, I like the subject. I like people's interest in it. I've been interested in it for so long, but to see it go so wrong and to the wrong hands and to see them co-opting it. You and I were talking about a Fox show where they were going into alien abductions. And, the way that they were talking about it, I mean, they were taking this kind of very big subject and the importance to humanity and turning it into a kind of alien scare tactic.
Yes, it was an alien scare where, it could happen to you. They're out there. They just take you from your bed at night. And then, it's a scary thing. And then they just kind of leave it. So nobody wants to be told that. Yes. And then also, again, they always bring forward, it's always so heavily based in technology.
Right.
So it's which is fine to a degree. It's okay. But when the whole conversation evolves around that makes me think that, okay, well, this is really about technology. Really, at the end of the day. Yeah, they want to introduce a technology or what have you, because that's pretty much the center of what the disclosure thing is for them, when it's really so much more than that.
Right, absolutely. Well, they've had the ability, they've had the training behind the scenes. The last time we had a manned mission to the moon is 1972. That's over 50 years ago. Yeah. You have no development on that. But in the background, they've got incredible space infrastructure laid out. They have the Starlink satellites now surrounding everything, and the whole Musk trip around that, who they've inserted into the culture through Twitter. It's interesting, Gigi, because they've gone so far and they're so far advanced. How can this picture ever reconcile if we don't get, I actually don't know what the formula would be unless you get a pole shift.
Right, which is, it's kind of on its way, really. I mean, they happen at a certain intervals.
Yes.
So, I think that the people who understand the truth and who are well researched and who obviously watch this show, they're probably going to be in for a little rougher period, because I think that we're going to have to go through false disclosure. And because I think that, there's just a lot of people in the world that just don't have an interest. Yeah. And that's a problem. If you're not genuinely interested in the topic, there's not really going to be any sincere understanding. And so the only way that anyone will become interested on a global level is if an event happens. So the only way that interest is going to be generated is if we see something in the sky or something's introduced. And of course, that can easily be done. And then the interest will be there, and that will be kind of like, I think, a tough initiation. And I think that only over time will we be able to really reconcile what is going on and what's real, the right conversations about prehistory, because they often talk about these parallel civilizations along with it. Really good conversations about technology, advanced technology. I think these can come if we are able to engage in a rigorous debate, and if we're able to, talk about everything that's going on, which is why it's very likely that if a UFO operation does occur to generate that interest, that probably there may be blackouts or the prevention of commentators coming forward and giving their perspective, because the UFO operation is very important. It's the cherry on the top. It's the operation that creates the new civilization.
Interesting.
Really, that it is a very important operation. So it's very important that, I guess, like in their mind, that it be done the best way as possible, which I think will involve censoring. I mean, Lou Elizondo just blocked you. I mean, how much? This is somebody who is the recipient of funding and opportunities.
Amazing.
He's blocking. Because this is the power of like an independent voice. That's how threatening that it can be.
Absolutely.
You can be on the cover of GQ, you can have a television show, you can have a book deal, and you're still threatened by someone that has significantly less exposure than you. And so,
interesting, isn't it? And there's a couple of funny things there, because, of course, that's the first real response from Elizondo for all those questions and, all those invitations to a gentleman's debate on the whole thing.
Yeah. They don't engage.
Yeah, they don't engage. Yeah. That's what it is. And Gary Nolan, who I think has really been primed to replace Elizondo in many ways as the front face leading on this, because that whole, the military thing is the piece I think they want to bring forward.
Mm-hmm.
But what I want to kind of see, what you're seeing in all this, is if you look out over what their program is and how that hits in the middle of, these various difficulties that we're looking at, and I'll be very America-centric for a moment. You have this dawdling president who doesn't seem to be with it, regardless of what stripe of politics you are. This is a guy who seems like he's, some kind of mental victim, whether it's dementia or something else. He's not all there, and I think even people on the left see that. So we have a dangerous situation that we've been placed in, and you've got these people who are very reckless with our foreign policy over in Europe, and this whole thing with Ukraine and Russia. So, we're looking out at some difficult things. And you've got this whole domestic terrorism bill, the attempt to silence speech and all the rest. When we look at that and we look in the middle of it, this whole kind of attempt to grab this emergency narrative around the UFO piece, if you see down the road, say, over the next couple of years, this and the election year 2024, what do you think that we're in for, without putting too much pressure on you to kind of prophesy?
No, it's fine. Yeah, no, it's fun. I think that it is basically the beginning of trying to force or supplant a whole new different type of civilization based on something that America was never supposed to be based in. And I think that there will be, eventually there will be, this, how I see it is like a super hyper technologically advanced stuff being introduced to humanity to kind of make up for some of the failures of the last probably, I don't know, 5-6 years. And I think that that's also going to attempt to replace religion and spirituality, right?
Yeah.
These technologies, everything is now going to be about being hyper technological as a way to make up for perhaps falling behind in other ways. And it's a distraction to get people to not engage in healing the wounds that have happened, especially in the last few years. I think the emergency power situation is obviously a way to just change the structure of America, rewrite the Constitution. They've been doing that already through attrition for decades.
Yes.
They've been doing it through attrition slowly. But then now it's time to really destroy it and to bring forward a new, different kind of civilization. Some people call it the Fourth Reich. I think that'd be pretty close. And I think this is an attempt, again, to just create a whole different world, a whole different society. And I think the alien narrative, I think I have a lot of concerns about basically taking the concept of aliens and creating religions around them. This is not my work. This has been talked about for a long time. I think that's definitely part of it. But really, if I had to boil it down, I'd say this is the, controlled demolition or the collapse of America in order to create a new America that is the exact opposite and inverse of what certainly the founding fathers had envisioned.
It's that North American zone that they've always wanted to kind of remove the Constitution and just call this place Homeland. That is fascinating, Gigi. What role does transhumanism play out in it and the forced biometric moves? They're already talking with the bank failures that you'll move in an emergency fashion to the central bank digital currency CBDC.
Yeah.
When we look at that, you're one step away from the digital ID and your genetic fingerprint and all the rest. How does that play into this? And what kind of a clash? Are you going to see a war over a situation like that with people resisting it to the point where it's just not going to happen?
I see it as, I think more and more people have begun to change their consciousness or change how they're thinking about things. And I think in the very beginning of the health scam, that I think people were believing that we all had to agree. And then if we didn't agree that, that's, we're just not going to exist. And I think that we've polarized so much in this country that many people are realizing that, we are so different. We're so extremely opposite that maybe it's okay that we don't agree. And I think it's this realization that is going to actually create two different paths in this country. That doesn't mean that the country has to split up or break up. It doesn't mean that. But I think that when it comes to people's consciousness, I think that there's definitely a bifurcation. And I think that some people will genuinely pay to get a chip in them. I think they want a CBDC. Like they want a digital currency. There's people who still, they enjoy wearing a mask. They enjoy this whole thing. And what do you do when a large portion of a population enjoys this? All you can do is create a parallel impulse and a parallel way of life that preserves and expands on the original concept. And so I think that we're going to see basically two different streams. One that is going to go into the technology, the kind of techno-feudalism, more hardcore. And I think we're also going to see people that create a different way. And I think the numbers on that are, we're still seeing that. But unfortunately, you can't go to people and say, don't get the chip, don't get a chip, and don't, because people, they have the free will to do that. So, but ultimately, these two paths will look very different if they're given long enough. They'll be very different humanities. So,
absolutely fascinating. And there's a lot of implications to it as well. I guess my first question is, what happens to you spiritually when you have adopted into this chip system?
Well, I mean, I think that when you do that, I think you're giving up a piece of your own sovereignty. I think that that's the exchange that's going on, is when the further and further you fall into the system, the less and less sovereignty you have, the less and less authority over your own life you have. And if people don't want to develop, what Rudolf Steiner would call the I, right? And sovereignty and individuality, there's a path for those people, where they'll go through their own kind of initiation, which is a degradation, unfortunately, where, because they didn't develop their individuality, because they didn't develop their I, they're sort of drawn into this different system. And this is actually something that it takes many different lifetimes to develop your I, or your mind, or your critical thinking. It doesn't just happen overnight. And so we're sort of looking really at the culmination of patterns and impulses that have been going on for thousands of years, really.
Right.
We're just getting that pressurization to the point where things are splitting, and we're beginning to see what's really inside of people, what is really developed, what do people really believe when push comes to shove. And which is actually, it's very difficult, but it's natural, because people have free will, whether or not they're going to use their lives to develop, or whether they're going to use their lives to essentially kind of degenerate. So.
Oh, fascinating. Well, that's really true. And it's almost like you get this opportunity through difficulty for tremendous growth, or the difficulty takes you out.
Yes, exactly. And, I don't think, though, that like everybody who has received a vaccine or everybody who participates in the system is a degenerated person. I don't think that it's that simple. But just speaking, broadly about the dynamics, I think that there's going to be lots of people who get, waist deep in the system of control, and I think that they'll come out of it. And I think that it's very important that we keep creating content and, parallel systems, and we open our arms to them for when they do want to come onto this side. I think that's very, very important that we remain loving and compassionate towards people who may have fallen into this system. I think that the idea that we're constantly fighting and putting each other down so tribally is not healthy. So that's what I would say there. I think that there is hope for people who do fall into that system ultimately. It doesn't mean that you're like, a horrible person or anything, but so I think they'll be going back and forth.
Right. There's a path to redemption.
It's a process. It's a process, and I think ultimately it's sort of the goal for the technocratic elite would probably be some kind of weird dystopia, because they're severely mentally ill. So you don't want to live inside their mind. You don't want to live inside the civilization that their mind is creating. So, but I think something
Just
else
take a
can
look
be
at
built.
Netflix.
Yeah. So, but I do think something else can be built on the side that will eventually take over in the future. Will eventually become the way of the future. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so much in that, actually. I'm going to try to move for some specific examples of some things. So we have this prophecy hanging out in the background. It's a Casey prophecy, and it regards Montana, your stomping grounds.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because he also mentions Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm.
And he said these areas will someday feed the world.
Yeah.
Along with South Africa. Later, we get a lot of people. This prophecy isn't published till 1968. So Casey gives it 1943. Turns out the guy himself never receives it because he goes off to war. And there's a weird thing where 1980, he finally gets his reading.
That's crazy.
It is weird. But what's interesting to me is that Casey is there. He's envisioning this, and he says, "Oh, this is going to be a center for many, many nations. This one town, Livingston."
Wow.
And then we get the advent of the Church Universal with Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who's carrying on some kind of a mixed brew of theosophy, and also some of like the Ballard I Am movement. There's a lot of these things that are in there, the foundations around Saint Germain and the Ascended Masters and things. And that came out of her husband, her late husband at that point, when she founded this. Now, it's interesting to me because she moves the entire thing with all that money and all the build-up, 20 years of this thing. She moves it all from California to Livingston, Montana. And she acquires 80,000 acres up there. And then after a while, we get this whole situation with, there's some problems. She's basically attacked in the media, saying, "Oh, she's a scaremonger" and all this kind of stuff because she's building up resources up there. And then the Church Universal kind of, after a while dwindles down. She dies, and it becomes a much smaller force up there. And I think a lot of the land is sold off. But this idea, Gigi, that there's a little town up there that somehow is involved in feeding the world and is a big part of our future. How does it strike you that it's up there?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was just feeling like there is maybe, I think there's like feeding the world in a sense of farming, which I could definitely see because, Saskatchewan is very big in like grain production, or at least when I was living in Canada, and canola and things like that. And so is Alberta, and so is Montana. But what if also another meaning of feed the world could be also spiritually nourish the world?
Right.
Because there could be something built there one day that is essentially some kind of temple or some kind of spiritual organization that also provides an impulse, a new impulse, and feeds the world in that way. Because the really interesting thing about the planet is that the holy sites are not really, it's not a logical conclusion. Like it's not just like, oh, I think the sun hits that area very nicely, I'm just going to build a temple there. A lot of the temple structures are where they are because the higher planes, like the etheric plane, will already have a structure there. So think like Shambhala, and then it can just over time, it begins to overlap back over the third dimensional plane. This is also like Atlantis Rising, same kind of thing, is that there's actually an etheric plane and an astral plane that have actual beings there, that overlap the earth. We would call that part of the angelic hierarchy or the spiritual hierarchy. And there's actual temples that appear at certain times and disappear at certain times in a very precise cyclical order. Now, there's major ones, there's lesser ones, and it could be that this area is so important because one day a temple will appear there or be constructed there, which may be in the future.
Interesting.
And so there may be some stewardship involved in that location.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wow. Isn't that interesting? I found it fascinating as something that was, hanging out there with all the shoot down things that happened in February. And it was all Montana this and Montana that. Montana back in that major spotlight. And what we've seen really is with the idea of Earth changes and things that Casey brought forward, and the idea that these shifts would take place, we don't know what might be surrounding Montana and Saskatchewan and all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right on the eastern side of the Rockies. So if there was a flood, you're looking at a protected zone because those mountains are high and they're wide, So, I mean, if something came from the west, like a tsunami, which I've noticed people talking about, like the Pacific Rim a lot, and the San Andreas Fault Line, which is that Pacific fault line where if there is any shifting, usually that whole coastline, feels it. And then so you have you're being bolstered by the Rocky Mountains there. So that would be, even practically speaking, that would be I would imagine a pretty safe zone if it was like flooding was an issue. So
it's fascinating because in the Casey work, you find Oregon, Idaho, Montana were safety lands for the Lemurians who were fleeing destruction. Mm-hmm. And one of the only leftovers that he said that we had were the Native American totem poles.
The Haida and the Salem. Yeah.
So
they're beautiful.
That's an interesting twist because at one point they're fleeing there, and then the next thing we know, we might be looking at a totally different Earth changes map at this point.
Well, one of the things that I've always seen when it comes to the Earth changes and pole shift is I actually think it's pretty exact. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, I actually think that when the land rises and disappears, I think it's an exact science. Like, I don't think it's like a random thing it may seem like that in the materialist sense where pressure just like builds up and we don't know where it's going to go. No, I think it's actually an exact science, and I think it mirrors prior epochs so that humanity can literally inhabit the same land that they did and go through the same initiation that they did. I think that's very important for the planet, and consciousness is actually to be on the same land, which is why you'll also see, like in regards to certain temples appearing or disappearing, or certain temples being built in certain areas, that's the same kind of thing. It's actually a cyclical, repetitive way that we evolve that involves the spiritual planes.
That's wild because there's the famous prophecy that Casey gives about the hot zone and the Poseidon temple rising off of Bimini, and it would seem almost absurd, right? You have this Atlantean landscape, they make these temples, and then they're going to rise, the temple intact after all that.
But if it's rising, and it'd be rising slowly with certain higher points, that, clearly that could suggest that it's going to rise backwards.
Incredible.
So it'll rise Poseidon first, and then it'll go into the middle of the ocean. You'll probably get some activity in the Pacific as well. I think I do think we're going to get some land rising in the Pacific as well. I think it's I actually think that there's because the Earth is actually enmeshed with the etheric plane and the astral plane. It's not separate. It's everything that happens on the Earth has already happened in the higher planes. And so the Earth is just expressing it. So it is an exact translation of something that's already happened. in the spiritual planes.
Fascinating. But those points, actually, there's a couple of questions I have for you here. One of them is, there was a guy who came forward as an AUTEC whistleblower, of all people. And he made an interesting observation, which was when he was there, they would get these reads on their radar that were not just large objects underwater, but actual land masses that would appear and reappear.
Yes.
Now is that possible?
Well, that's right out of Theosophy.
Yeah.
And that's right out of mystery texts.
Mm-hmm.
That's not only possible, that is exactly how the Earth solidified, billions of years ago. It actually became denser and kind of condensed into the material plane. That's the mystery understanding of things. And so there are periods that are kind of like twilight periods. The beginning of Atlantis and the end of Atlantis is one as well, where you get basically these islands or these areas that are surrounded by fog or mist.
Yeah.
And they appear at certain times and then they disappear. And sometimes there's even weird, strange people on them. Right? And this is obviously, the spheres are overlapping and then moving away from each other. So there's an exact planetary science as to why that happens in these transitional periods and where they occur, because those are real places, right? And so you have, obviously, like High Brazil is an example of this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And other places where sailors would be like, so I had this really weird experience where I found this island and the people there were so weird. They were speaking a language I didn't understand. And there's all these weird accounts of people basically finding, and even written accounts that are really old, and they call them like the fairy realm or the whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's like, that's actually part of what the Earth does when it's in transition. And eventually the land either solidifies entirely and we go into a more solid linear phase. We're kind of like locked down. Or there's a period where it will just stay kind of magical, actually. So
interesting. It reminds me of this account of a captain, Navy captain, and he is taking his ship through the Bahamas, and it's late at night, and they see off in their radar this metal mass, and it's so large in front of them that it's blocking out the stars. And they hear a weird hum with it, and the crew is starting to freak out, and he's saying, give me some data on this. Like, what is this thing? And they're like, well, it's some kind of metallic structure. It's gigantic. And he can't figure out what it is, but the engines start to fail. So luckily he gets the heck out of there. But what kind of activity do you think that could be? Because it lends this possibility of an alien base there in the hot zone. It lends the idea that there's a totally separate civilization operating there. And this is an interesting piece too, because we find that the false disclosure movement coming out of the CIA and the media, they'll use this idea of a group underground that's a threat now. And we'll get into that. But what do you think it is actually?
I think that there is a parallel civilization that is on the Earth. And I also think the Earth doesn't operate the way that we think it does. I think it's actually very mysterious. I think, like we're saying, things appear, disappear. I think there's certain alignments, like astrologically, that open stargates and close them and make these experiences a lot more likely or not likely. And I think people would be very interested in that science. But I think that there is a parallel, at least one parallel civilization that's from Atlantis. And I think that there's a good chance or a good possibility that they have high technology. I think that they may have been telling people that they're aliens, or people may think that they're aliens. But if you actually tune into their energy and you actually connect with it, whether it be the craft or whether it be individual, you feel that. and you're like, oh no, this is something that's from here. The whole system is from here, but it's really from a different time. It's from a different developmental period of the Earth, and it's sort of held back, or it's unable to live on the surface, if you will, or it's like a parallel thing going on that doesn't have the majority, but it still exists and may have very, very high technology.
And you think a group like, maybe like a secret group inside of the intelligence community, they may have at a certain point achieved some kind of contact with this group?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it would make sense to me that also this parallel civilization would also have a weakness in that they are not really human anymore. Not in the way that we are, not in the way that the people living their daily life are. Because I think that over thousands of years, I think that the way that I see it is I think that they've made certain decisions that they've probably devolved in some way or been going down a different path of evolution, an alternate path of evolution, right? And so I think that they're also very vulnerable because they're not really the species of the planet. No matter how many times somebody wants, some being wants to tell you that they were on the planet before you or they created you, that's just a lie. They would be living on the surface if they did. Right. So these sort of covert, weird groups that are often deformed or using advanced technology but have no spiritual development, this kind of thing, these are like little offshoots that I think could be, there's a very good chance, I think, that they're associated more with our distant past than being something that's genuinely off-world, though off-world beings from other spheres certainly exist, and life exists on every planet. That's certainly the mystery view of things. So that's what I would say there. That's
really interesting. It gives me all kinds of thoughts, and I'll just kind of, I'm thinking about Charles Hall and the Tall Whites. And this is a story that's been out there for a while. It's I've done a lot of research on it, and certainly I think that the claims that he makes about it are coming from a place of he felt like he had this experience. And he's also someone who was in the Air Force, and the way that he talks about the nature of his experiences. After all, he was the weather guy at Nellis for Area 51, and they basically were like, you're on your own. And when he's out there, he encounters these beings, but they look much more human than the Greys. And in fact, he says that at a certain point, he sees generals hanging out with the Greys and interacting with them just like they're interacting with these Tall Whites. And the general piece that he gives on it, Gigi, is that there's some kind of technology in exchange, and that they're here, that they live in our desert. And but their looks are very interesting to me because the way that he describes them, they're close, very close to human, and can pass for human under disguise, walking around. What do you think of something like that, and where would that group actually be? Because even though, he asked them when he had the occasion to do so, where are you from? And they would say things like, oh, it's a place that you wouldn't know anyway, and sort of avoided exactly saying where it was. But is that kind of a group necessarily from a star system beyond here, or could it just be a group that's here that looks a lot like us?
Well, I mean, I would probably have to encounter one in order to fully, absorb that. But my default, the public default or the main default that everybody seems to have, I think, in the ufology community and even the spiritual community, is that this is an alien. And I think that that's the default. And I actually would not default to that. That would not be my default. My first default is that this is a human being that is from another period of our own Earth's development. So Atlantis, around that period of time. We know that they had advanced technology.
Yes.
way more advanced than we have today.
Yeah.
And we know that they were very interested in genetic modification and creating absolutely bizarre looking chimeras and things like this. We know that if you study the mystery literature, you'll know that. And so for me, that's the first place where I have to go with it.
These are Casey's automatons
Yes.
described, and you find references to them in anthroposophy, but Casey really is like, let me
Yeah.
tell you about these automatons, and it was part of the problem for
Mhm.
these fleeing Atlanteans when they go into other lands. People would
Right.
say like, oh yeah, you're fine, but what are all these, weird robot / mixed animal hybrids?
Yeah. Or people who are just maybe genetically modified a little in a weird way. We had a whole civilization that was obsessed with that. And that was partly why the civilization fell. So my first thing before going into extraterrestrial, because that's actually very, very rare, because from my understanding of things, when the Earth sinks below the horizon, which is into the material plane, there's not a whole lot of life, actually. It's actually like Rudolf Steiner calls the material plane and the Earth the plane of death.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's actually not a lot of life in the cosmos at this level. We're sort of looking up into almost a representation of the higher planes. And so when you get into the etheric level of development, so for us, that would be the beginning of Jupiter consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe at the end of our earthly cycle here, that's actually where you start getting more into being in like the Star Trek kind of situation where beings from other spheres are coming and going, and in the astral plane. So that's kind of the culture of the astral plane,
Mm-hmm.
where you have to be at a certain level of consciousness on the planet to interact with beings from other spheres. When you sink below the horizon into the physical plane, some people call it like the quarantine or the moon lock. Actually, it's sort of like the planet locks down, and only whatever has been in contact with it till that point is interacting. That's how I personally see it. And that's because the Earth is really an envelope. It's really in an envelope in space. It's not, space isn't what we think it is. I would say that as well. And so how I see it is that the Earth kind of like locks down, and during that period, the spiritual purpose of that is not a punishment. It is so that we develop our I and our individuality. So we can't develop our I and individuality in the larger sense if there's all of these beings coming from other spheres, and it's like it was in like the Atlantean era or the Lemurian epoch, when these things actually did happen because the Earth was in a different condition. And so the moment that we sink into the material physical plane where we are now, we get our I, which is our soul and our individuality, and we kind of lock down so we can develop that. And it's actually inappropriate for, it's just not how because the cosmos works to create evolution and to create spiritual evolution. And so how I see it is the Earth kind of like locks down. And so whatever's coming in from my personal analysis is probably something from the eighth sphere that is trapped here. Or being sort of from the angelic or spiritual hierarchies that have access because they serve they're actually part of the human evolutionary scheme. These are the saints, the masters, they're the spiritual hierarchy of initiation. So what's happening a lot is there's an urge to take the spiritual hierarchies and even the system of the masters and turn them into aliens. So it's this weird false externalization of the spiritual hierarchies and turning them into alien beings because we're so materially focused that it's difficult for us to process that internally. And so I think that we can't actually understand the alien or interdimensional topic unless we understand cosmogenesis, unless we actually understand how the planet comes to be, unless we understand the spiritual hierarchies, because sometimes these different beings are seen as gods and things like that, which is incorrect.
Right, so it's almost like there's an imposter syndrome involved with it. Bring the alien eighth sphere worlds together. The eighth sphere piece, mystery schools laid out. It got out accidentally. through AP Senate. According to Steiner, it was kind of a disaster for this to come out at that point. And then it was kind of rehabilitated by Blavatsky a little bit. And then Steiner came out and said, that whole thing about the eighth sphere is the moon is ridiculous. And the eighth sphere is one of the most guarded secrets. But here's the truth about it. And gave us his version about it, which projecting into the period we're now, where it seems to be in rapid development, the idea is a kind of virtual reality zone. How does that relate to this whole alien piece and the way that that's portrayed?
Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought because my first spiritual experiences were with beings that I initially thought were aliens. And so my first foray into this field was thinking everything was an alien. So I come from an interesting position on this. And what I've learned over the years after studying classical esoterica is that it doesn't really. Basically, the eighth sphere is important because it sort of gathers up different soul essences or different entities that basically are not aligned with God. So they're not part of the natural order of things. It's sort of like selfish or fallen beings, fallen angels, things like that. They get caught up in this realm that is kind of like the moon realm. It's not the moon, but it's the realm that is between the earth and the moon itself is a portal to that. Mm-hmm. So every planet is actually really a stargate for the realm that it represents. And so it's definitely not the moon because the eighth sphere is in a different dimension. So it can't be the moon. Right. It's overlaying the earth and the moon. And the moon is sort of creating a lock around. And so you have all of these different beings, everything from tulpas or egregores, which are like things that magicians can create. Like you can literally have a magical group where you imagine an alien being. This is part of, magical rites. You can imagine an alien being and you can spend every day developing it. And that being that you create with your mind, it's not real. It's not of God. It's not natural. It's not natural. That being can then go and interact with people and say, hi, I'm Ashtar, or hi, I'm an alien, or hi, I'm this, or I'm that. I'm an angel. I'm an ascended master. So you can actually create these things because, as Ledbetter said, thoughts are things. So
it's a thought form.
It's a thought form, and they're called in the Tibetan tradition, they're called a tulpa, and in the Western magical tradition, they're called an egregore, as you probably know, and they're thought forms, but they actually take on and they can live for thousands of years if they're fed. And so, what do we do about that? On the side of
Gigi, how do you feed them exactly?
Well, you have to. This
energetic.
Well, yes. Well, you have to feed them through energy, right? Mm-hmm. All different kinds of energy.
Yes.
And so, how do you discern what's an alien and what's real when you know that exists? Exactly. Because most of these contacts and things like that, they're basically astral experiences. Mm-hmm. I mean, very rarely is it really a physical. Usually, those people are just scared right out of their minds. Like they're just. It's like really bad. But most things most experiences people have are astral, Yes. So that suggests that how do we know that? How do we know that? They're not coming from the eighth sphere. Right?
Well, it's fascinating because John Mack, who was really the leading educator on the UFO field and was a professor over here at Harvard, took tremendous grief for getting into the subject. His conclusion was we have to teach people how to defend themselves through astral travel. That's pretty amazing because it goes right in line with what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic. It's where the UFO topic turns woo. Yeah, and it's always going to turn woo. It's always going to go in that direction.
But don't you know it's about G-force and how we have to chase that thread and we can blow it out of the sky?
Yeah, I don't even want to know I don't even want to know where they would take it when they do turn woo. Probably like the Terminator, like that's something to look forward to.
Unbelievable. Gigi, amazing to see you. What's the name of the Venus special?
They're just it's in the playlist creation series, and they're just I've done basically 4 now, and Venus is usually in the title, but they're all in the creation series playlist.
Creation series, right? And that's Gigi Young on YouTube here.
Yes, Gigi Young.
Amazing material. Gigi, I'm fond of saying there's no greater ally or friend to the Dark Journalist X series than you. So thank you so much for everything that you do, and absolutely incredible work you've been bringing forth lately, with all the video series and the incredible production effort that you put into it as well. It's just off the charts.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Gaia TV, eat your heart out, right?
Gigi, just amazing. Stay right there and we'll go even deeper. The conversation continues at DarkJournalist.com. Of course, you can find Gigi's work here on YouTube with her popular series channel, Gigi Young. For a deeper dive, go to GigiYoung.com. Just incredible information. Be sure to join us on Friday, March 24th at 8 p.m. Eastern for a very special anniversary 2-part episode of the Dark Journalist X series. You don't want to miss it. See you soon.